When the day comes to confront the painful truth that someone you love, someone you call family, is a toxic influence in your life, the realization is more than just uncomfortable. It's shattering. Family, as we all know, is meant to be the haven, the safe place where we can heal and grow, the anchor in an often turbulent world. But what happens when the very people meant to nurture and protect you instead bring nothing but harm and pain? This is the agony many of us will face at some point in our lives. You might not want to hear it, but I must ask, have you considered that you might be the toxic person in someone else's life? Pause for a moment and think on that. The most difficult part of the truth is often its unrecognizable nature, hidden behind years of love, loyalty, and perhaps a misguided sense of duty. It's no secret that relationships, especially family relationships, are complicated. From the very beginning of the human story, we see dysfunction unraveling in the most sacred of bonds. From the tragic tale of Cain and Abel to the bitter strife within Jacob's own household, the family has been a place of both refuge and betrayal. So, it should not surprise us when we too face the dilemma of how much we should endure, when to stay, and when to finally walk away. Consider for a moment the story of Jacob. His was not simply a tale of hardship, but a roadmap for all those who, like him, wrestle with the agonizing decision of how to navigate toxic relationships. Imagine Jacob's state of mind as he fled from his brother Esau, seeking refuge in the home of his uncle Laban. His mind no doubt filled with hope. Finally, some peace, some respite from my brother's wrath. Here, with family, I will be safe. But safety never came. Instead, Jacob walked right into the arms of manipulation, deceit, and 20 years of pain. His uncle Laban was no ordinary man. He was toxic, a manipulator, a deceiver, a man who used others for his own gain, without the slightest regard for their well-being. His behavior toward Jacob was a textbook case of how toxic people operate. They take more than they give. They drain you emotionally, spiritually, and sometimes even physically. For 20 long years, Jacob worked for Laban without receiving fair compensation. He was not merely mistreated, but used. Have you ever experienced something similar? That feeling of giving everything you have, only to have it never be enough. Laban's behavior wasn't just difficult, it was abusive, draining, and exhausting. But perhaps the most insidious trait of toxic people is their ability to discourage you. Laban didn't celebrate Jacob's work. He took every opportunity to manipulate him into staying longer, doing more. Jacob's every effort was met with empty flattery. Flattery that wasn't for Jacob's sake, but to bind him tighter. For 20 years, Laban kept him in a cycle of discouragement and dependency. It's easy to see how this could happen. After years of being worn down, of being deceived, Jacob must have questioned himself. Am I wrong for wanting to leave? Is it selfish to dream of a life free from manipulation and lies? Toxic people know exactly how to keep you in this state of doubt. They twist the truth, making you feel guilty for wanting something better, for wanting peace. This is what Jacob endured under Laban's control. And the lies. Oh, the lies. Laban's deceit began on Jacob's wedding night, when he tricked him into marrying Leah instead of Rachel, the woman Jacob had worked so hard to win. This was no simple mistake. It was a deliberate act of betrayal. It was Laban's way of maintaining control, keeping Jacob in his grip. And it didn't stop there. Laban continued to manipulate Jacob at every turn, taking advantage of every agreement they made. Can you imagine the daily frustration Jacob must have felt, How it must have felt to wake up each day and wonder, how is he going to cheat me today? This is the nature of toxic relationships. They're a constant test of endurance. The frustration never ends, and there's no peace to be found. But Jacob's story doesn't end in defeat. After 2 decades of abuse and manipulation, something remarkable happened. Jacob finally saw things clearly. It wasn't just exhaustion that led to his decision to leave. It was God speaking to him. God called Jacob to a new season, a new beginning. And this is where his story becomes one of hope, one of liberation. Jacob didn't just decide to leave because he was angry. He left because God told him to. God spoke to him and said, "Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you." Genesis 31:3. It was not a casual suggestion. It was a divine calling. And when God speaks, there is no choice but to listen. Imagine the courage it took for Jacob to hear God's voice, to recognize the calling amidst the noise of years of manipulation and deceit. Oh, his moment of clarity wasn't born from frustration alone. It came from the deep realization that God's plan for his life was greater than the chains that held him to his toxic uncle. Sometimes we need a moment like this, a moment when we hear God's voice over the lies, over the hurt, and over the doubt. Jacob's obedience to that voice marked a turning point in his life. But, as with any journey toward freedom, the road is never as simple as we wish. It's easy to think that leaving a toxic situation will bring instant peace, instant relief. But what Jacob discovered, and what we often fail to realize, is that the act of setting boundaries, especially with family, is a complex and challenging one. It's not just about walking away, it's about creating a future rooted in God's promises. You see, setting boundaries is not a rejection of love. It is not an abandonment of those we have cared for or been bound to by blood. It is rather an act of deep love for ourselves, for our families, and for the life God is calling us to live. Jacob's decision to leave wasn't just about escaping Laban's control. It was about stepping into something more, the fulfillment of God's promises for his life. But this step was not easy. God told Jacob to return to the land of his fathers, but he did not promise that it would be an easy road. Jacob had no idea what awaited him. He didn't know how Laban would react, or what obstacles would arise along the way. He was stepping into the unknown, just as many of us must when we are called to leave behind toxic relationships. And yet, Jacob obeyed. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a detailed map of the future. He simply trusted that God's presence would be enough. Isn't that what faith is? It's trusting in God's promises, even when we can't see the full picture. God didn't promise Jacob a comfortable path. He promised his presence, and that was enough. The first step for Jacob in leaving was to gather his family and possessions. It wasn't a matter of just telling Laban he was leaving. No, Jacob needed to act decisively. This was no fleeting decision. It was a step that would affect the future of his family. As we read in Genesis 31:17-18, Jacob packed up his wives, his children, and all his possessions and left, without a word to Laban. It was a complete break. This moment of courage, of taking control of his life, is the essence of what we must do when faced with the same choice. Setting boundaries means taking action. It means saying, enough is enough. It's about saying, I will no longer allow this person or this situation to dictate my future. Jacob's journey wasn't just about him. He wasn't just escaping a toxic environment for his own well-being. No, Jacob was protecting his children too. He knew that if he stayed in Laban's house, his children would grow up in the same toxic, deceit-filled environment he had endured. He was making a choice not just for himself, but for the next generation. This too is an essential part of setting boundaries. We protect the future. We protect the legacy of peace, integrity, and love. Jacob's action was not only a step toward his own freedom, but also a way to break the cycle of dysfunction for his children. It was a moment of leadership, of choosing what would become the foundation for their lives. We often think of boundaries as something that only protect us. But in reality, they protect those we love too. The decision to set boundaries is not always easy, especially with family. But when we act in obedience to God's voice, we can trust that His plan for us and our families will unfold, even if the path is unclear. As Jacob continued his journey, the fear and uncertainty must have been overwhelming. It was not just the prospect of Laban's anger or the potential for more deceit. It was the unknown future that lay ahead of him. But in that moment of uncertainty, Jacob had something far greater than fear. He had God's presence. Jacob didn't know what would happen next, but he knew that God was with him. And in that, he found peace. That's the power of obedience. God's presence is with us when we trust Him enough to take those first steps into the unknown. When God called Jacob to return to his homeland, He didn't offer a detailed blueprint of what would happen next. He didn't say, "This is how everything will work out." Instead, God simply said, "I will be with you." This is the promise we must hold on to when we are called to walk away from toxic relationships. God doesn't promise us a trouble-free life, but He promises His presence, His guidance, and His protection. The beauty of this story lies in the fact that, by trusting in God's call, Jacob stepped out of the darkness and into the light. He left behind the toxicity of Laban's influence and began a new chapter, one in which God's promises would be fulfilled. And this is the hope for all of us. When we follow God's voice, when we trust Him enough to set boundaries, He leads us to a life of freedom and blessing. When Jacob made the decision to leave Laban, he was no longer a passive player in his own life. For 20 years he had lived under Laban's shadow, constantly manipulated, deceived, and drained of his energy and hope. But in that moment when he heard God's voice, when he realized it was time to step away from the toxic grip of his uncle, Jacob took his life into his own hands. He was no longer going to be controlled. Yet, the moment Jacob began to take control of his own life, he immediately faced resistance. Have you ever experienced that? The minute you decide to make a change, to step into freedom, it feels as though the world conspires to pull you back, to keep you stuck in the same patterns. Jacob wasn't just walking away from a dysfunctional situation. He was making a bold statement that he would no longer allow Laban's control to define his future. Laban's response was swift. When he learned that Jacob had fled with his family and possessions, he immediately pursued him. Can you imagine the stress Jacob must have felt at that moment? After all the years of manipulation, after finally making the difficult decision to leave, Jacob found himself being hunted down by the very person he had tried to escape. Laban wasn't coming to say goodbye or offer his blessing. He was coming to reclaim control, to drag Jacob back into his toxic hold. This is one of the most difficult aspects of setting boundaries with toxic people. They don't simply accept your decision and let you go. No, they react with anger, manipulation, and guilt. They see relationships as something they own, something they can control. And when you try to break free, they will do everything in their power to make you feel like you are the problem, that you are the one in the wrong for wanting freedom. Many of you may recognize this pattern. You've set boundaries, you've made the difficult decision to walk away from toxic relationships, but the moment you do, the person you're trying to leave keeps coming back, demanding your attention, manipulating you into questioning your decision. It's exhausting, isn't it? It feels as though you're constantly fighting to protect yourself and your boundaries. But here's the good news. Just as God protected Jacob, he will protect you too. When Laban pursued Jacob, the Bible tells us that God intervened. In Genesis 34:24, we read, "But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" This is a powerful moment. Laban, with all his deceitful plans and manipulative intentions, was stopped in his tracks by the very hand of God. God didn't just stand by and watch Jacob struggle. He actively protected him, ensuring that Laban could not harm him. What a beautiful reminder that when we follow God's call, when we step out in obedience, He goes before us. He fights the battles we cannot see and protects us in ways we cannot imagine. This is a profound truth that we must hold on to when we face resistance. When we decide to set boundaries, to walk away from toxic relationships, we will face opposition. But in those moments, we are not alone. God is with us. He will fight for us. He will be our defender when the enemy seeks to discourage or intimidate us. Jacob's courage in the face of Laban's pursuit is nothing short of inspiring. When Laban caught up to him, Jacob didn't shrink back or apologize for leaving. Instead, he boldly confronted Laban, saying, "What is my crime? What sin have I committed that you hunt me down?" Genesis 31:36. Jacob had been a victim of Laban's lies and manipulation for years, but now he was standing up for himself. He was no longer willing to accept the false accusations or the false guilt that Laban tried to impose on him. In that moment, Jacob took control of his own narrative. He refused to allow Laban to rewrite his story. And this is exactly what we must do when we face toxic people in our own lives. We must take control of our story, our future, and refuse to let others dictate it. We must stand firm in the truth of who we are and whose we are, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. Sometimes, standing up for yourself means having those hard conversations, calling out the lies, and refusing to allow toxic individuals to continue manipulating or controlling you. It's not easy. It's painful, and it often comes with great cost, but it's necessary. The truth will set you free, and in that freedom, you will find peace. In Jacob's case, the confrontation with Laban was not just about getting revenge or seeking justice. It was about reclaiming his life, his purpose, and his family. Jacob wasn't just fighting for his own freedom. He was fighting for the future of his children, for the legacy they would inherit. He knew that if he allowed Laban to continue controlling him, his children would grow up in the same toxic environment. He had to break the cycle for their sake. This is the power of setting boundaries. It's not just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting those you love. It's about ensuring that future generations are not enslaved by the same patterns of dysfunction and abuse. Just as Jacob fought for his children, so too must we fight for the well-being of our loved ones, even if it means walking away from those who should have been our protectors but instead became our oppressors. God's presence was with Jacob in that moment of confrontation. He stood firm, and God honored his obedience. In the end, Jacob and Laban reached a peaceful agreement to part ways. They established a boundary, a heap of stones to mark the place where they would no longer cross paths in harm. It was more than just a physical boundary. It was a spiritual declaration. I am moving forward. I am leaving behind what was, and I am stepping into what God has promised for me. Jacob had broken free from Laban's control, and with God's help, he would never return to that toxic place again. As Jacob walked away from Laban's toxic influence, the weight of his decision must have felt both heavy and liberating. The fear of the unknown often haunts those of us who choose to set boundaries, especially with family. But for Jacob, each step he took away from Laban's grasp brought him closer to the life God had intended for him. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was a necessary one. One of the most difficult aspects of setting boundaries with toxic people, whether family or otherwise, is the constant pull to return. When we make the decision to walk away, there is a deep temptation to doubt ourselves. We question whether we've made the right choice. We wonder if we are being harsh or unforgiving. We might even feel guilty, as though we are betraying the very people we once held dear. But here's a truth that Jacob's story teaches us. Setting boundaries is not about revenge. It's about protecting the life God has called you to live. It's about safeguarding your peace, your purpose, and your relationship with Him. Jacob wasn't leaving because he hated Laban. He was leaving because he was choosing to honor the calling God had placed on his life. He was stepping away from the dysfunction in order to embrace the freedom God wanted him to have. This act of stepping into freedom was not only an internal shift, but a practical one. Jacob was about to face a major confrontation. Laban, furious that Jacob had left without warning, wasn't just going to let him go without a fight. We can see this in the way Laban chased after Jacob for 7 days. Laban wasn't pursuing him to reconcile. He wasn't seeking to make peace. No, Laban was coming to drag Jacob back into his toxic world. In those moments when you set boundaries and choose freedom, the resistance can feel overwhelming. It can seem like everyone and everything is against you. But let's remember this key truth. God sees your struggle. When Jacob was faced with Laban's anger, God intervened in a powerful way. In Genesis 31:24 we read, "But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.'" Here is the power of trusting God when setting boundaries. You are not alone. When you choose to obey His call, when you choose to protect your peace and the well-being of those you love, God fights for you. He will make a way when the path is unclear, and He will protect you from the harm that seeks to follow you. When God intervened in Laban's plans, He did so with such clarity. Laban was warned not to speak to Jacob in any way that would bring harm. This divine intervention gives us a glimpse into the very nature of God's protection over His children. God saw Jacob's pain, his obedience, and his trust, and He responded with power. Laban may have had the power to manipulate, but God had the power to stop him in his tracks. We can take great comfort in this truth. When we stand firm in God's will and make the difficult choice to set boundaries, He will protect us. He will stand guard over our decisions and keep us from falling back into unhealthy, toxic patterns. It may not always look like we expect, but we can trust that God's protection is more than enough. Jacob, in his wisdom and courage, didn't just passively wait for God's intervention. He actively took steps to protect himself and his family. He called his wives, Rachel and Leah, and shared with them his plan to leave. He didn't ask for Laban's permission. He acted decisively. Jacob wasn't going to allow Laban's manipulation any longer. He was taking control of his own life, and he was doing it in obedience to God's will. This brings us to an important point. Setting boundaries requires action. It requires us to stand up for ourselves, even when it's difficult. It's not enough to simply wish for a better life or hope that things will change. We must actively make decisions that protect our peace and our calling. And that requires courage. It requires the courage to say, "No more. I will no longer allow this to define me. I will no longer allow this person or this situation to drain me." One of the hardest things about setting boundaries is the fear of confrontation. Jacob had to face Laban, the man who had controlled him for 20 years. But he didn't back down. He confronted Laban with the truth, calling him out on his lies and deceit. This confrontation was not born out of bitterness or a desire for revenge. It was a declaration of freedom. Jacob was saying, "I will no longer be manipulated. I will no longer be your pawn." For us, setting boundaries often involves difficult conversations. It might involve standing up to family members, friends, or colleagues who have controlled or hurt us. But these conversations, though painful, are necessary. We don't have to do it alone. We can trust that God is with us, guiding us, and giving us the strength to speak the truth in love. When Jacob stood before Laban, he didn't apologize for leaving. He didn't shrink back or beg for forgiveness. Instead, he stood tall, confident in the truth of his decision. He called Laban out on the wrongs he had committed, and he did so in a way that was firm, but not hostile. Jacob was not seeking revenge. He was seeking freedom. This moment is pivotal. It shows us that setting boundaries isn't about cutting people off with anger or hatred. It's about walking in the truth and making decisions that align with God's plan for our lives. It's about finding the courage to stand firm and protect our peace, even when those around us may not understand or approve. And the blessing of that freedom. It's the freedom to walk into what God has for you. It's the ability to move forward with the peace of knowing you are in alignment with God's will, trusting that He will continue to guide and protect you. As Jacob continued his journey away from Laban's clutches, he must have felt a mix of emotions: relief, anxiety, uncertainty. His decision to leave had been courageous, but now he was stepping into the unknown. The path ahead was unclear, and the comfort of Laban's control was gone. All Jacob had was his faith in God's promise, the assurance that God would be with him as he obeyed the call to leave. We too often find ourselves in situations where stepping out of a toxic relationship feels like stepping into the unknown. The fear of what lies ahead can be overwhelming. When we are accustomed to living in dysfunction, even the idea of peace can feel foreign, and the idea of freedom can feel terrifying. Jacob's story speaks to us in those moments. He didn't know exactly what awaited him after he left Laban's house, but he trusted God enough to take that first step. It's in the unknown where we must place our trust. Trust is not always easy. We want to know every detail, every step, every outcome before we make a move. God doesn't work that way. He doesn't give us the full blueprint for our lives. He gives us the next step, the next moment, and then he asks us to trust him with the rest. Jacob didn't know what would happen after he left Laban. He didn't know how his family would react, how they would survive, or what the future held. But one thing he did know: he wasn't walking alone. God had promised him his presence, and that was enough. "I will be with you," God had said. Genesis 31:3. This promise was not just for Jacob. It is for all of us. When we face the unknown, when we take a step of faith into unfamiliar territory, we are not doing so without support. God's presence is enough. He doesn't leave us to figure things out on our own. He walks with us, guiding us, leading us through the valleys and the wilderness. In Jacob's case, his decision to leave was not just about escaping Laban's toxicity. It was about stepping into God's promises, promises of freedom, of hope, and of blessing. When Jacob stepped out in faith, he didn't have all the answers, but he had something far greater, God's presence. And that was enough to propel him forward. We often think we need to have everything figured out before making a change, but the truth is, we will rarely have all the answers. The path will rarely be clear. But God does not call us to walk by sight. He calls us to walk by faith. Faith means trusting that God will provide, guide, and protect, even when we don't know exactly how things will turn out. Jacob's journey was not without challenges. After he fled from Laban's household, he faced another challenge, the looming threat of meeting Esau, the brother from whom he had fled many years before. Jacob's past was filled with guilt and regret from the way he had wronged Esau, and now he was facing the possibility of reconciliation, or worse, confrontation. The fear Jacob felt in this moment is understandable. After all, how do you face someone you've hurt so deeply? How do you face someone who might want to harm you in return? Yet, Jacob's story reveals a crucial truth. Even in the face of fear, God's promises still hold. As Jacob prepared to meet Esau, he feared for his life, but he also sought God's guidance. In Genesis 32:9-12, Jacob prayed, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, 'Return to your country and your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant.'" Jacob's prayer was an acknowledgement of his dependence on God. It was a recognition that even though the road ahead was fraught with fear and uncertainty, God's faithfulness would guide him through. He trusted that, no matter what happened, God would be with him, protecting him and guiding him every step of the way. In our own lives, we too are called to trust God in moments of fear and uncertainty. When we set boundaries with toxic people, when we walk away from the things that have held us in bondage, we may face moments of fear. We may fear the unknown, the fallout, the consequences of our decisions. But in those moments, we must hold fast to God's promises. He is faithful to guide us. He is faithful to protect us. He is faithful to carry us through the storm. God's presence is not a passive gift. It is an active force that works in our lives. It goes before us, making a way where there seems to be no way. It strengthens us when we are weak. It comforts us when we are afraid. Jacob's story teaches us that when we obey God's call, when we step into the unknown, we can trust that God is already there, preparing the way and walking with us every step of the journey. Jacob's prayer for protection was not just about securing his own safety. It was a recognition that his journey was part of a greater story, God's story. God had a plan for Jacob's life, just as he has a plan for each of us. When we step out in obedience, we become part of God's greater purpose, and he will ensure that the story he is writing in our lives will unfold according to his will. As Jacob prepared to meet Esau, he did so with the knowledge that God had already gone before him. The same is true for us. As we navigate the difficult task of setting boundaries, and walking away from toxic relationships, we do not do so alone. We do not walk in fear. We walk in faith, trusting that God will guide us and protect us as we step into the future He has prepared for us. Jacob's journey was one of faith, one of courageous obedience to God's calling. As he left the grip of Laban's toxic influence and faced the fear of his past with Esau, he was walking through the unknown, with only the promise of God's presence to guide him. This chapter of Jacob's life reveals a profound truth. Obedience to God's voice is the key to unlocking the blessings and the peace He has for us. It's easy to talk about obedience, to acknowledge its importance in theory, but the real test comes when we must choose to obey in the face of fear, uncertainty, and opposition. Jacob's obedience was not passive, it was active. He made the choice to leave Laban, to set boundaries, to step into a future that was uncertain but filled with the hope of God's faithfulness. But even as Jacob moved forward, the challenges didn't cease. As he made his way toward his brother Esau, the weight of his past sins began to settle in. Jacob had wronged Esau deeply. He had stolen his birthright and his blessing, leaving his brother angry and vengeful. For years, Jacob had lived with the guilt and the fear of retribution. And now, as he approached Esau, the dread of facing the consequences of his actions consumed him. Can you relate? How many of us carry the weight of past mistakes that seem impossible to undo? How many of us fear the judgment of others, knowing we have hurt those we love, whether intentionally or unintentionally? But the beauty of Jacob's story lies in this very moment. It was in his obedience that God began to move, in ways Jacob could never have imagined. Jacob's fear and guilt led him to a moment of desperation. He didn't know what to expect from Esau, and so he prayed. In Genesis 32:9-12, Jacob cried out to God, acknowledging his unworthiness and pleading for God's mercy. He reminded God of the promise He had made to him. Return to your country and your kindred, that I may do you good. Jacob wasn't seeking to manipulate God. He wasn't bargaining. He was simply laying his heart before the Lord, acknowledging his need for divine intervention. And God responded. In this moment of deep dependence, God revealed His power to transform circumstances. When Jacob finally encountered Esau, he was met not with anger or vengeance, but with grace and forgiveness. This is the power of obedience. When we trust God enough to obey, even when we're afraid, even when we don't understand what's ahead, God works in miraculous ways. He brings peace where there should be fear. He brings reconciliation where there should be division. Jacob's reconciliation with Esau was not the result of his own efforts, but of God's grace working through his obedience. It's important to understand that obedience does not guarantee an easy path. For Jacob, the journey was filled with fear, uncertainty, and heartache. But every step of the way, God was with him, guiding him, protecting him, and providing for him. And as Jacob took each step of obedience, he moved closer to the fulfillment of God's promises for his life. Obedience, when it is rooted in trust and faith, leads to transformation. Jacob's obedience transformed his relationship with Esau, but more importantly, it transformed him. It brought him closer to God. It helped him step into the future God had prepared for him, and it made him a vessel through which God's promises were realized. Many times, we think that obedience is about following rules or doing the right thing because it's expected of us. But obedience, in its truest form, is about aligning ourselves with God's will and trusting that his plan is better than our own. It's about surrendering our desires, our fears, and our doubts, and allowing God to take the lead. When we do this, we experience the deep peace that comes from knowing we are walking in His will. Jacob's story teaches us that when we choose obedience, we choose the path of blessing. When we choose to walk away from toxic relationships, to set boundaries, to trust God's voice above all else, we are choosing to walk in the freedom that comes from living in God's will. It's not always easy, and it's not always comfortable, but it is always worth it. We are often tempted to take shortcuts, to settle for what is familiar, even when we know it's unhealthy. But God is calling us to something greater. He is calling us to a life of freedom, peace, and purpose. And that life is found through obedience to His voice. The key to living the life God has called us to is not found in our own strength or abilities. It's found in our willingness to obey. It's found in our ability to trust that God knows what's best for us, even when we can't see the way ahead. Just as Jacob's obedience led to freedom, reconciliation, and blessing, so too will our obedience lead us into the life God has promised. As you reflect on Jacob's journey, ask yourself, are there areas in your life where God is calling you to obey? Are there relationships you need to set boundaries in? Or steps of faith you need to take, even if the path is uncertain? The life God has for you is waiting, but it requires your obedience. Jacob's journey, filled with pain, fear, and uncertainty, has now led him to a place of freedom and promise. Through years of toil, manipulation, and heartache, he has learned what it means to trust God, to obey His voice, and to break free from toxic relationships. But now, as Jacob finally steps into the land God promised him, we see a deeper truth unfold. The journey was never just about escaping from Laban's toxic grip. It was about stepping into the abundant life that God had prepared for him. So many of us are caught in the same struggle. We live with toxic people, relationships that drain us, and environments that constantly test our peace. The temptation is to stay, to endure, to accept what we know rather than face the unknown. But Jacob's story shows us that there comes a point where God calls us to walk away, to break free, and to trust that He has something better waiting for us. The hardest part of this journey is the step into the unknown. Jacob didn't know what awaited him when he left Laban's house. He didn't know how Esau would respond or what challenges he would face along the way. But he knew one thing: God was with him. And that was enough. You might be in the same place today. Perhaps you feel uncertain about the future. Maybe God is calling you to make a difficult decision, to set boundaries, to walk away from a relationship or a situation that is toxic and draining. And perhaps, like Jacob, you feel afraid. You wonder, what if I fail? What if the future is worse than what I'm leaving behind? But here's the truth that Jacob's story reveals. Stepping into God's promises requires trusting His timing and His will. God did not promise Jacob that the journey would be easy, but He did promise to be with him. And that promise still stands for us today. God is not calling us to walk alone. He is with us every step of the way. As Jacob approached the land of his fathers, he knew that this moment was not just the end of his journey from Laban. It was the beginning of a new chapter. God had promised to make him the father of a great nation, and now that promise was coming to fruition. This was a moment of both reflection and anticipation. Jacob had fought, struggled, and endured for so long. And now, as he stood at the threshold of the land God had promised him, He was stepping into his destiny. There's something incredibly powerful about stepping into what God has for us. It's not just about leaving behind the pain and the struggle of the past. It's about embracing the future that God has already prepared for us. When we trust God enough to obey, when we step into His promises, we are aligning ourselves with His greater purpose for our lives. And that purpose is always better than we could ever imagine. Jacob's decision to leave Laban was not just about protecting himself. It was about trusting that God had something more for him, something greater than the life he had known. And when Jacob took that step of faith, God honored it. Jacob's obedience set the stage for God's blessing to overflow in his life. As you reflect on Jacob's journey, consider your own life. Are there areas where God is calling you to step into His promises? Are there toxic relationships or situations you need to walk away from in order to embrace the future He has for you? Just as God was with Jacob, He is with you, guiding you, leading you into a life of freedom and peace. The beauty of obedience is that it doesn't just change our circumstances, it changes us. Jacob's story is a story of transformation. From a man who was deceived, manipulated, and bound by fear, Jacob became a man who trusted God enough to walk into His promises, to step into the future that God had prepared for him. And the same transformation is available to you. When you trust God enough to take that first step, when you set the boundaries that need to be set, you will begin to see the fruit of obedience in your life. You may not see it immediately, but God always honors faithfulness. He always rewards those who trust Him. As Jacob settled into the land God had promised, he was not only receiving the fulfillment of God's promises, but also stepping into the legacy of faith that would impact generations to come. This is the power of obedience. It's not just about us. It's about the generations we are called to influence, the legacy we are called to leave. Jacob's obedience to God set the stage for a future that would impact the entire world. Through his children and his descendants, God's plan would unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. When we step into God's promises, we too become part of something much larger than ourselves. Our obedience has the potential to impact not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us, and even those who will come after us. As you reflect on Jacob's story, consider the lessons we can all apply to our own lives. First, God's promises are always worth the journey, even when the path is unclear. Second, obedience to God, though difficult, leads to transformation. It's through obedience that we step into the fullness of God's plans for us. And third, the courage to set boundaries, to walk away from toxic relationships, and to trust God is not just about our freedom. It's about protecting the future God has for us and for those we love. In what areas of your life is God calling you to obey? What steps do you need to take in order to walk into the promises He has for you? If Jacob's story resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. What steps are you taking toward obedience in your own life? And don't forget to subscribe to the C.S. Lewis channel for more insights and inspiration from stories of faith and transformation. Your journey toward freedom and fulfillment begins now.